Hello, YouTube. So let's do an update on Ukraine. So the last video I made on this was the 15th of May, 2022. And my prediction then was it would be about 2 months of attrition, and then Russia would basically have to retreat or face collapse. And we now, what are we on? We're on the 13th of September. So that's what, 5, 9, it's 4 months basically, give or take. And arguably it started, yeah, the collapse started a little earlier. So I was off by 2 months, which, for me, I think that's actually a pretty decent analysis on the grand scheme of things. Especially so the fundamental reasons are basically those that I stated in the original video. So, maybe a quick recap on what happened with the war. And of course, it started very early on. There was the flash push to try and capture Kyiv in the first few days of the war, using the paratroops, storming the airport, flying in reinforcements. That all basically crashed and burned almost immediately. There was another big push from this direction, which also sort of just ground to a halt. There was a push on Kharkiv that never really got anywhere. And then there was a push in this region that did actually capture some territory. And there was a big push in from the Crimea that actually captured all of this territory and eventually hooked up about there. And they managed to capture some part of this side of the river, including Kherson, the only big city they actually captured. And all of this area here, that was the first thing that basically ground to a halt. This was after the immediate advances in the first few days. It was clear that the wheels were coming off this thing, and about a month or so later, it was partly the Russians retreated because, well, they weren't. They were just going to sit there and get shot up if they did. So they retreated everywhere here, or were pushed out. And the claim was they were going to regroup and reinforce the Severodonetsk region. So they next massed virtually all of their forces, all of the mobile forces in this region, and with great effort over about a month and a half, 2 months, that sort of thing, they managed to capture that sort of area, which is including Severodonetsk, which was the second. It's a reasonable sized town, city, that sort of thing. Now, what happened next was basically what had to happen. I mean, these aren't the most inspired of predictions because they're all sort of obvious from what you can see on the ground, and that's that Russia has run out of offensive mobile troops. By the time it takes you a couple of months just to sort of push forward a little bit like this, you've lost your early ability. Yeah, so their early ability, they're getting through troops like crazy. So usually when you attack, you typically want a huge dominance in mobile troops. I think the reckoning is usually 2 to 3 to 1. And they might have had that early on, but as time has gone by, this is sort of atrophied away. So locally, they've atrophied away, and by the time you're making your last big efforts to capture some small amount of territory, you're essentially now locked in a war of attrition. But the problem is that Ukraine is being supplied with first-rate weaponry that basically means that this war is unfightable for Russia. In that the HIMARS things, they have a range that goes, this sort of range from the front line, and they can hit basically whatever they want, and they've got some huge supply of these things. So there was this talk that they were going to push in the Kherson region, where, I mean, this is a nightmare position, this area down here, to defend, because you've got your back to the river, which means you blow up the bridges and you're basically on your own. So this is an extremely vulnerable position for Russia. Now, normally, if you're fighting the offensive war and you've got the the dominance of troops in the area, bridgeheads like this are fantastic, because you put as many troops into them as you can, then you sort of break out and you pan out all over the place. But Russia's clearly not in that game at the moment. And so what happened was a couple of months of attrition, which is basically not the hardest thing to predict. But yeah, that was basically my last video. And this is maybe in nowhere as best summarized as this fantastic image. This was in the Crimea. And so this is like 2.5 months after my prediction that it was going to be just attrition and then Russia was going to collapse. And this really does just highlight how untenable the position is for Russia. Now, planes are ludicrously expensive and very slow to replace. This isn't the World War II days where there are great factories producing whatever Spitfires and Mustangs. These things have lead times on them of forever, like years, decades, that sort of thing. And so this is some airbase in Crimea, and this is the day beforehand where let me zoom in on this. Yeah. So all of these things, these embankments here, are basically such that if there's a near miss, it protects the plane from the blast damage. And you take a look at what else there is here, and there's barracks or workshops. There's more barracks or workshops over here, and you scroll down to what's left afterwards, and all the barracks and the workshops, they've all been destroyed. Every single plane basically has been destroyed, with the possible exception of 2. And you sort of count up the destroyed planes, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And this is probably almost the entire plane strength, the aviation strength of the Crimea region. And you can sort of say this sort of thing because if you take a look at a typical a big air power like America, they have in total only some 300 planes or 300 Lightnings and maybe 200 Raptors, which sounds like a lot until you realize these things are usually broken down into roughly thirds. Only a third of those will be combat ready, and the sort of things you might have on the front line, and those have to be split over everything. And so you take it out now. Look at the area these things have to be split over, and you've got the whole of the Ukrainian region, and these were just the planes in the Crimea. Russia's got to have its planes over the whole area, so it's entirely possible. But my reckoning would be that was almost the entire the entire air power of the Crimea region gone in an instant. And the thing is, you can't just fly in more planes. Even if you had more planes to fly in, there's no point in flying them in when they can just all be blown up like that again, right? This is an unsafe place to have your planes. So you now take a look at this, and when you can't have your planes where they can sensibly provide air support, your air power is essentially neutralized. Right? You can't keep them safely on the ground without bunkers that would keep them safe. And if you don't have them, those take years to build. So this is a big no-no. And this is probably part of. So the thing that's amazing about the most recent um, advance by the Ukrainians is they managed to do what the old school war of maneuver, which is you concentrate your troops, and then in a few days they basically cleared out all of this region here, which threatens the resupply of a lot of the areas down here. I think the main supply route comes down this way. So this is kind of a disaster for Russia. Now, yeah, I don't know how much of this was. So there's the thing: when you've got more people than the enemy or better supplied, you want to keep up the pressure everywhere on the front line, basically pinning down the enemy troops such that they can't react if there is a need for them to react. And then you actually sort of localize all your troops together and have one big coordinated push. And it was old school war of maneuvers. And the surprising thing is, in the era where satellite images will do this for you, the Russians didn't see it coming, which means they're either their satellites are sort of sleeping on the job, or the Ukrainians were very good at concealing it. And it's also very clear that the Russians in this area had very little will to fight. These are sort of force multipliers on your troops. Is how willing are they to fight? I mean, if you've got lots of troops but none of them want to fight, and I don't think any of them have a great desire to sort of die. The Ukrainians, they're fighting for their home territory. They're fighting for their homes to get it back. This is a war of aggression that they're defending. They're pretty motivated folks, and they've got the weapons to win. Which, So this puts all of the victory signifies on Ukraine's side, whereas you take a look at Russia, they don't have the supply, they don't have the military intelligence, and they don't have the will to fight. I mean, this is looking bad. I mean, so the early retreats that Russia had, these were sort of semi-organized retreats. They sort of looked at it, they had the resources to retreat, and they probably did it in reasonable order. They lost loads of stuff, but at least it was a planned retreat. This thing here clearly caught the Russians completely by surprise. And now it jeopardizes the supply route, and this is still hugely vulnerable. In that, what are your choices? You retreat from Kherson, which would be fairly humiliating. Having made all of this effort to capture it, but it's probably the best option left on the table for them. Or alternatively, you have to defend it, otherwise you just get pushed out. And the more you defend it, the more likely it becomes that you just get cut off here, and all of the material that you put in there is basically killed or captured. And now you've got this huge gap in the front line that you've got to fill somehow. And the Russian forces are stretched pretty thin as it is. So, it looks like it's Russia is locked in a war of attrition with a better supplied enemy, a better supplied, motivated enemy that there's no real way they can defeat. And all of this, it must be said, has been fought on the backdrop of interesting, broader things that you would have thought would have been used in such a war. So for instance, it would have been relatively easy for Russia. Let's do Russia red. To blockade Odessa, which would stop them from exporting all this grain, which would be a big economical impact for Ukraine. and of course, it would also lead to a lot of people starving, and it would also destroy a lot of the infrastructure of Ukraine. Um, and so Russia came to an agreement that they wouldn't do that. Um, Again, there are. It's one of those weird things. You'd have thought there wouldn't be rules in warfare, but there are. There are. Yeah. Um, yeah, it's one of those bizarre things. It always reminds me of that scene in The Princess Bride. You know, what you mean? I'll put down my sword, and you'll put down your rock, and we'll try and kill each other like civilized people. Well, yeah, those are the rules of war. That yeah, you're trying to kill each other, but yeah, certain things are beyond the pale. And the other thing that's interesting is yeah, these pipelines that go across this region. No one blew them up. No one shut them off, and virtually everyone had the power to, if you like, push the X button to to go nuclear on this. So Europe, okay, let's go for some different colours. Let's have Europe in green. So Europe could have just said, "Nah, we're not buying any more oil." It caused huge disruption to Europe, of course, and it would cause huge disruption for Russia. I forget how much of Russia's economy is oil, but you know, if all of a sudden they're getting nothing from it, they can't sell the oil to anyone else. They need to build pipelines to do it, which would take decades. So this would be, you know, really bad for Russia and really bad for Europe. Meanwhile, Ukraine could have actually blown up the pipeline with one of these sort of all these precision missiles. If you can hit your planes like this, you can blow up the pipelines no problem. So Ukraine could have done this, and if you like, forced this situation on everyone else, but they chose not to do it. Um, so yeah, it's one of those things that it's war, but clearly everyone doesn't want to. There are limits to how far people are willing to push this. Ironically, it's the tanks rolling in, sort of all that sort of thing doesn't bother anyone, but blowing up pipelines, blockading ports, this would probably be too much, which is bizarre, but there it is. Anyway, so that's my current update on the state of the war, and what's likely to happen is just sort of more of the same. Russia cannot sensibly get its air power near the front without just getting it blown up on the ground. And all of the supply, ammo bases, forward command centers, as soon as they're found, Ukraine can just blow them up, which basically means that this Russian force on the front here, is just going to get atrophied away until you just get more pushes like this one that you just had from Ukraine, which will basically rout. Anyway, so that's my appraisal of what's happening in Ukraine. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you found it useful, maybe drop a thumbs up on it, and see you next time.